Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. My name is Jacob Shapiro. I'm the Director of Analysis. Before we get to a conversation with George, I just wanted to remind listeners that if you feel like it, you can check us out on iTunes, on SoundCloud, on YouTube, wherever it is that you access this podcast. Leave us a review if you feel like it. Let us know how you're enjoying the podcast and if there's anything you think that we could be doing better. Also, a reminder to check us out at geopoliticalfutures.com for all of our written analysis. It's been a particularly busy week in the world, and you can follow along what's going on in geopolitical developments via our daily memo, which is sort of a daily newsletter that summarizes the most important things that you need to know in the world. But we also had some separate analyses on the unexpected resignation of Kazakhstan's president, on Italy joining the Belt and Road Initiative. My colleague Philip Orchard wrote a great piece on the U.S.-China trade war and the current state of negotiations between the two sides. We also reached back into the vault and republished a piece called The Rise and Fall of the Islamic State. It's one of our special reports, and I think one of our best reports, and I think especially relevant now, as many people are talking about the Islamic State being defeated, which, in a sense, yes, the Islamic State has been defeated, but in another sense, this is a fight that is really just in its infancy. So thank you again for listening. Please leave us some reviews. Check us out online. And now to a conversation with George about the future of democracy. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. We are in George Friedman's dining room today, and George is right next to me. Say hello to the listeners, George.
Hello, listeners.
So today we're going to talk about something a little more abstract, a little more ethereal even. Basically, I think there's a lot of concern, George, in the Western world that democracy is failing somehow. A lot of angst that there are problems inside the democratic system, that we're eventually headed towards some kind of authoritarian moment. What do you think of that?
Well, there's a kind of paradox. We're worried that democracy is failing because people are electing people who are going to be authoritarian. We really have to unscramble this, and it's perhaps critical when we look at Brexit or Trump or any number of other leaders in the world to try to understand this paradox. No one debates that they were elected by either the majority or by the electoral system in place. They do argue that they are inappropriate. They aren't doing anything that they didn't say they would do. So, for example, the people who voted for Brexit clearly said they wanted to get out of the EU. The charge against them was they really didn't understand the issues, they didn't understand the complexity, and so on. So there are two attacks on democracy, in a way. One attack comes from some of the people who are elected who tend to play fast and loose with the democratic rules. And then there's the attack from those who directly attack democracy by attacking the outcomes of elections. So when we look around the world, we see people who were elected, Trump, Brexit, people like Viktor Orban, people like the Polish government, the Italian government, none of which you can claim stole the election. But you claim that the voters weren't sophisticated enough to understand what they were voting for. And the people who say this don't see this as a direct attack on democracy, because the assumption of democracy is vox populi, vox dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God, which is probably overstated, almost certainly overstated. But what's happening is that when the outcome is not what you wanted, you question the process. Well, that's always been the case. In this case, there's a fundamental question of whether democracy is working when it doesn't elect the people that you think are appropriate, or it elects people who are authoritarians, but who ran on an authoritarian platform. They are doing what they said. So how do we unscramble this? This becomes an enormous problem. It becomes a challenge to Euro-American society, which is somehow built around democratic rule.
Yes, it Well, and I think that people perhaps don't understand quite what democratic rule means because our original political society was not built around democratic rule. It was built around representative democratic rule. And you had three sort of key examples there in what you just said. You had the United States, where you have Trump coming to office and people worried that he's an authoritarian. The other side was just as worried about Obama being authoritarian. You have Brexit, where a government really went to the people and gave a decision completely to the people, and we're now in the chaos of that decision to go there. And then you have Eastern Europe, where you have exactly what you're talking about, where you had people were elected, and they have this kind of authoritarian edge to them because they want to restrict some forms of freedom of speech. They want to tighten control over party apparatuses. So is there a thread connecting those three? Like, how do you think about the problem that you've identified here in those different settings?
Well, let's begin with the American founders. They really were not Democrats. They wanted men of property to rule, and the Senate was elected by legislatures, not by the people. So the founders distrusted government and distrusted the people and tried to create a system so complex and incomprehensible that even if the worst person were elected, he would be unable to rule because you would actually have to have overwhelming consensus from all branches of government. And we've sort of seen that with Trump. Trump has said many things he wants and many things he will. He wants the wall. And 3 years into his presidency, he's still battling whether he'll be allowed it. They created a government that was democratic in the sense that it was, you tended to choose your representative. But once the representative was there was limited things they could do, including the president.
Yeah, although I think one of the things that people, when they point to evidence of Trump's authoritarian tendencies, they would say, well, he declares a state of emergency so he can try and build his wall on his own, which is kind of the impulse that frightens people.
Well, the problem was that there is a law allowing Trump to declare it. It's not a clear law. It was a law intended for nuclear war, I believe. But whatever Trump did with this, I mean, you can't argue that he committed an impeachable offense by doing this because it's simply, there is this law there. So I think the desire, we also have to have a sense of perspective. The desire to build a wall, wise or not, okay, is not the same as suppressing newspapers. One is, in terms of policy, wise or unwise. And using the emergency laws on that basis, I think, was not what was intended. But the law as it reads, nobody seems to argue that he can't somehow do it. You may now have Congress do it. So there's a difference between being clever, the way that Franklin Roosevelt was clever. He didn't like what the Supreme Court was ruling. They were all Republicans. So he decided to get a law passed that allowed him to appoint 3 more. The Democrats are coming up with this idea now, too, that they want more to expand the Supreme Court. Several Democratic congressmen have said that. It's not in the ambiguities. I mean, it is in the fact that Brexit was the best example. Cameron called for an election because he wanted to put this question of leaving the EU aside. And he was expecting, and everybody was expecting, that the people would vote for staying in the EU and the subject would be closed. It didn't happen. They voted against it, to the horror of a lot of people, except for the majority who did vote for it.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out the majority in England, and the majority in Wales that voted for it. A majority of Scotland and a majority of Northern Ireland did not.
Within the democratic system of the United Kingdom being it, as in the United States, Alabama may not vote for it, the rest of the country does. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that you can say that, but the fact is that the British people as a whole voted for it. Now, was it wise? Was it unwise? Well, I mean, one way to delegitimize the election is the way that its opponents did, by labeling those who voted for it ignorant, uninformed, lied to, manipulated, and so on. So one way to delegitimize an election is to say that the people who defeated you were stupid. And It's good politics if you can get away with it. But Britain has been struggling with the question. A large segment of the population, nearly half, perhaps more than half now, don't want the outcome of the referendum. And these people want to somehow say that this was a massive mistake. Well, okay, it may have been. But then what do you do with democracy? One can raise the question of why Cameron decided to call a vote. And the answer is the people like Cameron were out of touch with the reality of England. There was great unhappiness about the EU. This was not a small minority. It's still not a small minority. Even if it is a minority, it's not small. So now a democratic event happened. A certain segment, the elite, if you will, don't like the outcome. In the name of democracy, they undermine it. Viktor Orban in Hungary has never lied about his intentions in governing, and he was elected. His critics want to find some evidence that he stole the election. He didn't steal the election. He appealed to the Hungarians, who are democratic and who are not particularly enamored by liberalism. By liberalism, I mean liberal democracy, in the sense that all newspapers should be allowed to publish and so on. Okay, so there is, as he said very openly, an illiberal dimension of democracy. So what do you do with that? Well, in the United States, there was the Bill of Rights, which transcended the vote. In many of these other countries, there is no such limitation. And so you wind up in a situation where the lovers of liberal democracy assault democracy. Brexit is a case like that. An excellent case could be made that leaving the EU was a bad idea. The problem is that the people voted. So what we are having, I think, and this is a Euro-American problem, after World War II, there was a kind of consensus on what kind of governments we would have. And the elections, whether one party or the other, tended to track this. Since 2008, that consensus has broken down, partly because the feeling that the elite really failed, that they can no longer be trusted. And as a result, what happens is that in country after country, what we'll call exotic parties, that is, parties that simply reject the consensus of what kind of government they should have, are winning elections. In the United States, there's a limit because of the nature of the Constitution, which really imposes certain limits on the people. Now, even there, the Constitution is totally respected by everyone except for those who oppose gun control, who are for gun control.
No, but I mean, there's a deeper point to be made there, which is that you've written about this before, that when was the last time Congress actually approved a declaration of war? And the United States has been at war for how long? It used to be that Congress controlled the budget. Now the president submits a budget to Congress and gets it rubber stamped. There has been a decline in the power, especially of the legislative branch in the United States, which I think is one of the reasons people are afraid, because the president has become this figure imbued with much more power than the system thought that a single person should have.
Well, the problem is that the federal government in the United States has accumulated far more power. And that happened in World War II. In World War II, the American economy was, this is not too overstated, it was nationalized. The allocation of resources, what you could produce, was taken over by the federal government. After World War II, things backed off a little, but the federal government had become much more complex than it was before. And the management of such a thing, became harder and harder, and the fractious nature of the legislature and the kind of people who were willing to serve in it, and the inability to make decisions, except on votes, tended to concentrate power in the presidency. We should not dismiss the question of nuclear war. nuclear war psychologically changed the role of the president. When Roosevelt was going to war, he was constantly polling to see if he could. With nuclear war, there was no poll possible. You had 15 minutes to take a decision, and suddenly the president, symbolized by the man carrying the football, the officer carrying the nuclear code, could make unilaterally the decision to go to war. This led to things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Congress was barely consulted, and a group of unelected officials, selected by the president, were making these decisions. And then we get to the question of healthcare. Well, if you're going to nationalize or semi-nationalize or quasi-nationalize healthcare, that is an enormously complex issue. Congress was not designed. The president was designed to govern. Congress was designed to create the laws.
The president was designed to manage foreign policy. I don't think the president was designed to govern.
Well, he was also empowered to build roads and things that were very important at the founding. So certainly his power grew, but also as a practical matter, how do you manage what has become a vast corporate entity, the United States of America? You can't have all the shareholders do it. So you have to have. So this is one sort of thing, but the United States is unique in the sense that still there is the Bill of Rights, still there are constitutional processes, and they can still be challenged. Yes, we don't have declarations of war, which I think is tragic, because that would force people to say, I am going to war. And both when we went to war, feel that moral obligation to support it, and perhaps refuse to go to war. But at the same time, the Constitution does not require a declaration of war. It allows for any other means of authorizing it. And I think the majesty of a declaration of war is outstanding. But even here in the United States, you have the point. Donald Trump was elected by the constitutional mechanism. He can be defeated in the next election. If he breaks the law, he can be impeached. But the desire now is to find out he must have broken the law somewhere that will allow us to impeach him. Well, that's part of the political game here, but it's still a question of the old principle that democracy is the system under which the defeated respect the victors and share with them certain common values. And what I think the problem has become is that the values are no longer common. The difference between the various factions has grown recently, not only in the United States, but elsewhere, that they recognize the other's election as a betrayal of democracy. And it goes both ways. It went that way with Obama. It went even further with Trump. But in Europe, I mean, the EU wants to sanction the democratically elected governments of Poland and Hungary for various wrongdoings. So what has happened here is a breakdown because I think there are two factions. There's on the one hand the political factions. On the other hand, there's the technocracy. And the technocracy are those people who claim that government is a technical matter, much as I just described the US government. And those who have the expertise to manage this should be allowed to manage it. In Brexit, the real objection was that these people have no idea how complicated a situation they've made. They've voted to leave the EU. They don't understand the consequences. Really, this should be left to us. In the EU, we constantly hear that it was interesting to switch it a little, that at the beginning of the negotiations, the EU's minister who handled the negotiations said the British really weren't sophisticated enough to deal with this. If you remember at the beginning. Now, the idea that the United Kingdom lacks diplomats of sufficient sophistication to deal with the question is an amazing charge. But it was made, and has been made continually. So essentially, the EU, I say, finds it very difficult to manage a democratic system where the opponents win and who really oppose the EU. They find it difficult in Austria. They find it difficult in Italy. So at a moment when the assumptions that founded the EU are being questioned, and questioned democratically, the technocracy tries to delegitimize the vote. On the other hand, the voters very frequently look at the technocrats as tyrants, that they have usurped the power of the people. And nowhere in Britain, but Britain does it show itself. I mean, it was amazing. The parliament called an election. The election was held. They decided to leave. Since then, I'll put it this way, the European Union is terrified that the British will leave because they're the second largest economy in Europe, and it would set a precedent that could unravel the entire system. On the other hand, the financial elite, again, to simplify the matter, is horrified at the thought of leaving the EU. So what you have is the EU plus the British elite working together to delegitimize the election. The problem is not this election. I mean, this election is an oddity. It is that it sets a precedent that the principle of the voice of the people as a voice of God is now undermined. That election is not now definitive. It does not definitively set the stage for who governs based on what he said he would do. Instead, it's a tentative step. In the United States, everything is a tentative step, ultimately. The founders wanted nothing to be a final step. Europe has a parliamentary system which has final steps when you control it. And you are endangering it because what will come out of this is we already see the paranoia of the technocrats about the people. You know, how could these idiots have voted this? But the other side will be the people will become paranoid about technocrats, which is also happening. And so I'll argue that it's not just two parties competing with each other. It is two understandings of what liberal democracy ought to be like. In one case, something handled by experts. In another case, something handled by the inexpert but empowered people. And this can really endanger the entire Euro-American system. And both sides, from my point of view, are guilty. The public for thinking they know the answer to things that they don't know. The technocrats for thinking they know the answer to things they don't know. And David Cameron will go down in history as authorizing an election that he thought he would win and losing it.
Sure, but I mean, that's what democracy is supposed to do. I mean, I think you put your finger on it when you said that what's really going on here is that there is now a lack of common ground, that there are no common values between people. So most technocrats are not sitting in their offices divining some perfect bureaucratic plan to screw over the little man, right? Most technocrats think that what they're doing is in the best interest of the people, and
Sure.
they are uniquely suited to do it.
Yes.
And like you said, there is now a divide between the people who see technocrats and elites who have enriched themselves greatly in the current financial cycle and don't enjoy those same benefits the way that they do. So they say that's very nice that you think you're doing what's best for us, but we're actually going to listen to somebody who actually speaks to our fears and our values. And I think that's where the fear is, because that's when you get the beginning of demagogues. People who, instead of talking about the best interest of the people and who are willing to serve the people, play upon emotions, play upon fears, use those fears to come into power, and then once in power, can manipulate those fears and the system to do what they want, to do their bidding.
Well, I think there's another thing we have to talk about, which is contempt. The public has growing contempt for technocrats who they feel claim to be experts in things, but aren't. And 2008 was crucial in this. There's also the contempt of the technocrat for the people, who argues that government is not a matter of the will of the people, but the expertise of the governor. And this mutual contempt can be seen throughout Euro-American society. And that's the danger, because one of the things that we always thought that democracy was about is if you lose the election, you accept it with good grace. You are the loyal opposition, and you prepare for the next election. I was watching television the night Trump won, and the question somebody asked, "What am I supposed to tell my son now? You know, how can I explain this?" You explain it. There are elections. You sometimes lose, and when you do, you show grace, and you prepare for the next election. This was so far out of his bounds of belief that Trump could win that he couldn't imagine that. So, from my own opinion, which is unimportant, we should ignore it, but we should take very seriously how this is corroding what we once called Western civilization.
One of the things I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that perhaps states and countries and populations have become too big for states to manage. I mean, you had the rise of liberal democracy in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, but alongside that, you also had, like you said, the rise of the power of the state itself. And I wonder do you think that one of the reasons that these governments are running into such problems is because a system that was designed for maybe 10 million people max is now having to deal with a system of 80 million to 300 million? These things.
It wasn't designed to deal with anything. The government was a modest undertaking. And in the United States, since World War II, it has become a far vaster undertaking than anyone envisioned. If you take a look at the responsibilities from our fisheries to our air, to our treatment of other races and genders and everything else, there is no instrument that can manage all this coherently. It is undertaken to manage society. And the founders knew the society was unmanageable in that sense. And the reason they limited government was not merely because there were very few people, because many of these things simply were beyond governments. One of the things we have is, on the part of the technocrats, the idea that there's no limit to what the government can do, even as they fail. From the standpoint of his opponents, there is a fear and a dread of the national government and what it can do. And then there are those, the authoritarians of Eastern Europe, who look at this and say, there is nothing government can do, at least that I don't want to do, and I will do it with democratic support. So there are three flavors. But I think the fundamental problem is this. If you sit down with the Federal Register and take a look at the decisions that are coming out on a daily basis, on any day, you're stunned. The vastest corporation, Apple, doesn't try this. Our federal government does. And it is institutionally not up to the task. And the people who manage it, the people who wrote the details of the Healthcare Act, have enormous power. They make decisions, and they're not only not elected, they're not known. So it isn't the Secretary of Health and Human Services who makes the decisions on healthcare. The detail of whether or not you will be able to have insurance cover this particular operation, that comes from. So it's really a question of, we have to reconsider, what do we mean by the state? What don't we mean by the state? What are the limits of democracy? And what are our obligations as citizens when we lose?
Well, then let's close on this. We started by asking, is democracy failing? And in the course of that, we had to ask, what is democracy and what is the state, and meander around a bunch of other ways. Would you say that we are at some kind of inflection point, that something is different right now than it was, say, 50 years ago? Or do you think that really, this is just the problem of democracy throughout all time, throughout its entire existence. This has been the problem of democracy. And we happen to be in a difficult time in the world, politically, economically, and that is creating the kind of tension that will eventually resolve itself.
The United States has a long history of democracy and has systematically changed its institutional relationships 3 times. The first time at the founding, the second time after the Civil War, the second time after World War II. It has a history of looking at its institutions, having a massive crisis, usually a war, and changing direction. We have to remember that democracy in Europe is a relatively new thing. The Habsburg Empire didn't have it. The Hohenzollerns, barely had it. The Anglo-French had it. What we're seeing, I think, in Poland and Hungary,
I feel like the Greeks would want me to say the Greeks also had it.
They would want me to say it, but but the point is that in much of Europe, certainly including Russia, is in Europe, democracy is neither ingrained nor is it self-evidently a preferable mode of rule. And this is why people like Viktor Orban are winning overwhelming majorities. It's not because the people are stupid. It is not because he's stolen the election. He hasn't. It is because there is no conviction deeply embedded in democracy. Britain will survive. British democracy will survive. The French have always been ambiguous on democracy. But for the rest of Europe, it is not an institutionalized principle. Nor is it in the EU, because the EU is an enormously undemocratic system. Nobody elects anybody. It's indirect and everything else. So I would say, yes, Europe is having a crisis of identity. After World War II, it was decided to all be democratic. Well, it's now many years later, and it's a question, exactly what does that mean, and what do I want to be? And it's being handled like most European affairs with mutual recriminations and yelling. In the United States, there is a shift coming in the sense that the federal government is simply incapable of coping with all of its responsibilities competently. Now, what comes out of this is mystery, but something comes out of it. But I think it's in Europe that we really are facing the existential crisis of democracy. And we're facing it even in Britain, who had a referendum. The referendum was clear. And they've spent all of this time trying to sabotage it.
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with you about Europe, but I am sure that after that answer, I need a drink, and everyone listening does too. So, George, thank you very much.
How dare you not agree with me?
Until next time.